Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Explorers Club World Elephants Week. We are very excited to be sharing and exploring the incredible nature of elephants and the incredible people that are studying them around the world. Monday night, we had Elephants 101, and last night we focused on sort of behavioral change and wildlife trafficking. And tonight, I'm super excited to be introducing one of our new shining stars at the Explorers Club, Sateesh Venkatesh. Sateesh is a conservation biologist who has worked all over the world from northern Thailand to the savannas of South Africa. He's an amazing guy who was honored in our Explorers Club 50 honorees that you need to know about that are doing great work. And we will be exploring this evening, human-wildlife conflict has become a real problem now that we're making strides in stopping the poaching. So Sateesh is focusing on animal behavior and elephant cognition. So tonight we're going to be hearing from Sateesh as well as Lisa Barrett, Sarah Jacobson, and Sherman De Silva about the work they're doing in elephant cognition. I'm so excited to learn what is an elephant thinking, and how can we, the more we know, the better we can stop and address the human and wildlife conflict and learn about these incredible animals. So without further ado, I'm honored to throw the mic over to Sateesh. He'll be introducing everybody and doing some Q&A. So I'm Mark Fowler, the Vice President of Conservation at the Explorers Club, and I'm very excited to throw the mic to Sateesh Venkatesh. Sateesh, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, thanks for that great introduction. As Mark said, my name is Sateesh Venkatesh. I'm part of the Explorers Club 50 honorees, and I've been working in conservation all over the world, studying many different types of wildlife. Particularly, I'm interested in studying large mammals, so elephants falls into that category. I've worked with elephants both in Africa and Asia, and most recently I've been working with a group of semi-wild captive elephants in Myanmar, looking at some personalities, variations within them, and how that relates to conservation efforts and how we can use our insights about elephants and how different they are in conservation and in different avenues for welfare and in the wild as well. Similar to a lot of the speakers tonight, I'm really interested in using how elephants think, how cognition works, and how animal behavior can be used to mitigate different human-wildlife conflict issues around the world. As we heard about yesterday, there's a lot of different conflict issues, and understanding more about how animals in general think and view the world around them is really important, especially for animals like elephants who are very different from us and have very different senses from us. So understanding how they think, view the world around them, and how they react to that as well, and how they interact with that is really important. And we're going to talk to some great speakers tonight that will take you through their amazing work about elephant cognition, how they study it, and all the different avenues. So each of the speakers tonight has a different way of studying elephant cognition and studies a different group of elephants. So tonight what we'll have three different speakers. They'll talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a short period after each speaker where we can answer some Q&As from that individual speaker. So it's going to be a slightly different format to the previous nights. But if you have any questions after each speaker, please put them in the comments and we'll do a short Q&A. And then after we go through all of our speakers, we're going to be joined by John Roberts up in northern Thailand, and he's going to be joining us with some live elephants out in Thailand. The elephants are just going to be walking around doing their thing. John will give us a little intro about who the elephants are and what they're doing there. And then during that time also, we can do a little bit more of a Q&A and answer any additional questions that you guys have from the talks, or if seeing any live elephants spokes any new questions for you, we can answer them as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Sarah Jacobson, who is a PhD student at CUNY University of New York, CUNY University of New York Graduate Center, and a member of the Comparative Cognition for Conservation Lab at Hunter College with Dr. Joshua Plotnick. Her dissertation research focuses on variation in behavior and cognition between individuals in a wild population of elephants in Salak Pra sanctuary in Western Thailand. She's particularly interested in differences between elephants that spend the majority of their time within the protected sanctuary and those that take risks entering the surrounding areas and the agricultural areas in that. I'll now turn it over to Sarah Jacobson. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Okay, great, thank you. Hi everyone, thanks to the Explorers Club and World Elephant Day for inviting me to come speak to you tonight. I'm currently starting my 4th year of my PhD studying elephant cognition and behavior as part of the Comparative Cognition for Conservation Lab, as Sateesh said, working with Dr. Josh Plotnick. And our lab focuses on studying cognition not only because we're very interested in the abilities that have evolved in different species, but also to be able to inform conservation. So tonight I'll be focusing this talk on how our research is looking into what wild elephants are thinking. I think a lot of us are interested in elephants because they display some similar cognitive abilities to humans. We know that they can recognize themselves in mirrors, which may be related to empathy. We know that they can cooperate and understand their role in a cooperative task. But unlike humans, they have this amazing sense of smell that they are often using to make their decisions, and they're doing this oftentimes over other senses like vision. And this is just some of the information about cognition that we've learned from studies with captive elephants. And there has been a lot more that's been done, and Lisa will tell you even more about the exciting research that she's done with captive elephants later. But since I'm focusing on studying cognition in the wild, I first want to say it's definitely a challenge without the controls of captivity. But we think it's important to understand the cognition of wild individuals as well, so we can directly apply what we learn to conservation. And as was mentioned at the beginning of this session, it's particularly important to address the issues of human-elephant conflict that threaten these endangered species. Humans and elephants have come into closer and closer contact as forests have been converted to agriculture and human development. As you can see in this map of part of Southeast Asia, so the red here in this map are changes in forests, so loss of forest habitat between 1973 and 2009. And I'm showing examples from Asia, but this is certainly also a problem for African elephants. As human development increases, the conflict over agriculture in particular has become more prevalent, as farms are literally on the edge of forested or protected areas. And these farms are providing high quality food resources for elephants. Of course, the farmers that are living next to the elephants are struggling to maintain their livelihoods when elephants are coming in and eating a bunch of the crops. And this results in agonistic interactions and sometimes deaths for both elephants and humans. So it's definitely a big issue. So our goals are to know more about how different wild elephants think so that we may understand more about the decisions that some of these elephants are making to venture into human areas, whether it's this elephant that was breaking into a house in Thailand and was caught on video, or this elephant in India that's trying to cross the train tracks here, or some of these elephants in Western Thailand that we've seen at our study site getting into crops of cassava and sugarcane. So interestingly, not every individual in a population will actually take these risks. So we really want to investigate what abilities allow them to navigate these barriers and how we can use what we know about their cognition to come up with better solutions to conflict and move towards this coexistence with elephants. Why do we think that understanding cognition in particular could let us know more about this issue? Well, we've seen quite a few examples of elephants getting around fences that people erect to keep them away from human areas, so electric fences typically. And we're particularly interested in the problem solving that we're seeing. As an example, I'll show you this video here. So this is a one-wire electric fence that's separating the elephant from the sugarcane. And what you see is the elephant has a stick in its hand, or sorry, in its trunk, not its hand, and is using it to try to take down the wire without getting shocked. So that's pretty innovative behavior, trying to get around this problem of not being able to get to the delicious sugarcane and not getting, a minor shock in the process. And we've seen several examples of this type of behavior, and we think that, elephants are probably we've seen many elephants do this with fences, but they're probably also using problem solving and flexible decision making frequently when they're entering human areas as they respond to the changes in human behavior as people are trying to keep them away and using different deterrents to keep them away. So while some of these innovative abilities might allow elephants to adapt to anthropogenic change that's bringing them in closer conflict with humans as well. And we think that, since this is a serious issue, perhaps knowing these abilities of elephants in one area in particular can help the conservationists in that area plan different ways to deter elephants that are accounting for these abilities. So to look into these questions specifically, I'm working in the Kanchanaburi province of Western Thailand in Salak Pra Wildlife Sanctuary. This is the area we're in Western Thailand, and then blown up here. It's a protected area, but it's surrounded by agriculture. And we have this long-term monitoring project where we're using some remote sensing motion activated camera traps to collect video and look at behavior across the population. So we're focusing in 4 parts of the sanctuary. We have 2 watering hole areas, these 2 blue and pink areas. And then we have this yellow and orange area, which are on the edges of the sanctuary covering crop fields. So you can see these maps on the right, what some of the setup kind of looks like. We have these camera traps in red, focusing on the behavior of the elephants at the watering hole. And again, here in the crop field, we have the camera traps in red, and the blue represents some towers, some watchtowers that we have as well. And to give you an idea, you saw some of the night video. What you saw with that fence was an example from the camera trap at night, but I'll give you an idea of what it looks like during the day at some of these watering holes. So we can get some pretty high quality footage from this. And for footage like social relationships, behaviors, and cognition as well. And, in particular, we can also use this footage to identify the elephants, which is a really important piece of our investigation into the individuals in this population. And you can use features like the folds and tears of the ear, shape of the earlobe, and maybe tail hair shape as well. So far from this footage, we've identified about 120 individuals in the population. Some really cute little ones that we see too. And an ongoing cognition research project that I'm leading is investigating innovative problem solving in elephants by providing them with this novel puzzle box. So in this puzzle box, there are 3 different compartments, and each compartment has a different type of door that they have to open. In this example, there's a pull door on top, a slide door in the middle, and a push door on bottom. And inside each compartment is a tasty piece of jackfruit. And the elephants can smell this jackfruit through holes that are in the sides of the boxes. They really like jackfruit, so it's definitely attractive to them. And we're interested in seeing how different elephants approach this new thing in their environment, how they interact with it, and how many of these doors they're able to solve. And we're using camera traps again to see this footage. So I can just show you some shots of what different elephants look like here. We are still collecting and analyzing data, but I can tell you that we are seeing quite a bit of variation in how elephants approach and solve the box. Some, like this elephant, are pretty hesitant. They barely touch the box before moving away. Others will approach it and, try a lot of different ways to get in, but aren't necessarily successful. And then we also have some elephants that approach pretty quickly and solve all the doors pretty quickly, which has been really exciting to see that we have some innovators in this population. So I have a lot more video to watch and analyze, but hopefully the results of this study will be out in the near future. And we plan to definitely continue this research, looking at cognition with wild elephants, especially since we've seen that it can be successful in the wild. Individuals are interested in engaging with the puzzles we've given them. They're returning multiple times to interact with them. And in the future, we're definitely interested in looking at, more cognitive studies, whether problem solving can be socially learned potentially when we get groups of elephants approaching the box like this. And then also, we want to investigate other types of flexibility, such as how quickly an elephant can learn to switch techniques when rewards change, and looking at cooperative problem solving in the wild as well. But importantly, we really want to investigate whether any of the abilities that we can observe in wild individuals relate to whether those same individuals choose to spend time in these human-dominated landscapes. And are there differences in the way they solve problems, for example, between individuals that choose these different behaviors? For example, we might expect that elephants that spend a lot of time in the crop fields are more innovative than elephants that don't. And if that's the case, perhaps we have to change the methods like fencing that we're using to keep elephants out of crop fields, because they're going to continuously sort of take on this challenge of overcoming the barrier. So with that, I would like to thank everyone that makes this work possible. Josh and everyone at the Comparative Cognition for Conservation Lab, the Department of National Parks in Thailand, who allows us to conduct this work, all of our research team and rangers in Thailand, and all of our funding sources, including the Golden Triangle Asian Elephant Foundation, who will be joining us for the live stream later tonight. So thank you. I can take any questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's great to hear about all your work and about how these elephants in the wild, how you can study these elephants in the wild. It sounds like quite a challenging problem. There was a couple of questions we had. The first one was, you mentioned that you've identified over 100 elephants in the sanctuary. Somebody was wondering about how many elephants probably live in that sanctuary.
Yeah, so the estimates are a little bit rough, but we think between 200 and 300. And there might be some that we are not currently, where our cameras are, we aren't currently getting that part of the population. So we still have, a little bit further to go there. We're excited about the progress. I think we might have lost Sateesh.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're
okay.
Good.
I'll just keep going. I think my video froze. But the other question is, do you think the differences in individual elephants' approach to strategy is indicative of their different personalities?
Yeah, so that's something we're really interested in looking more into. And I think with more different cognitive tests and just different tests of personality that we're hoping to deploy in the sanctuary sometime soon, hopefully, we'll be able to answer that question better. But I do think that personality likely has, a component with that, especially something new in their environment. Some individuals might be more attracted to new things or more scared of new things. So it's likely that that's a factor.
Looks like we may have lost Sateesh there for more than just a second. I'm getting no audio from him. Sarah, we can circle back and ask you any other questions once we get Sateesh back. But Shermin, if you're with us, we can move on to your presentation if you're here.
Hi there. Can everyone see and hear me?
Yep.
Great. All right.
Sorry about that. I'm back if you guys can hear me.
Yeah.
We hear you.
We can hear you, Sateesh. We were just going to move on to Sherman here. If you have a little introduction you want to throw up, or
Yeah, I
You
can do
can
that.
go ahead because I think we're ahead of schedule a bit.
Perfect. Okay, so first I'd like to thank Sarah, and now I'll introduce Sherman. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sherman De Silva, who's the president and founder of Trunks and Leaves, a nonprofit focused on conservation of the Asian elephant and their habitat. She obtained her Ph.D. from University of Pennsylvania, studying the behavior and ecology and demography of Asian elephants, and directs the Udawala Elephant Research Project in Sri Lanka, which she initiated in 2005. She's also the founder and trustee of Effect in Sri Lanka, creating a preserve for elephants in Sri Lanka, as well as a member of the Asian Elephant Specialist Group of the IUCN Species Survival Commission. Dr. De Silva is going to talk to us today about her work on elephant social and what the complex social system and what this complex social system really means. Dr. De Silva, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you, Sateesh, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for this event, to the Explorers Club and the World Elephant Day for organizing this event. I'm going to share my screen now, and let me know if you can see that.
yep, we can see it great.
Okay. All right, so I study primarily Asian elephants. But in this talk, I'll kind of give more of a bird's eye view background initially about just sort of all elephants in general and how Asian elephants compare to other species of elephants. And I like to start, and I know this is a very specific audience that we're talking to. So many people probably are familiar with all the different species of elephants, but generally when I talk to people and I ask, what do you think of when you think of an elephant? What do you think you know about an elephant? How does an elephant behave? How does an elephant think? The answers that I get and the conception that people have in their minds is largely based, I think, on research on one species, and that is the African savanna elephant, because that's the species that has been studied the longest. It's out in these very open environments where you can easily see them. And so for a very good reason, we know a whole lot about the lives of African savanna elephants. But of course, we've been talking about Asian elephants today, and there's also the third species of elephants, the African forest elephant, which has recently finally been recognized as its own distinct species. And these two other species of elephants are much less studied, have historically been much less studied, because generally they've been harder to observe. They're in closed environments, more forested environments. They tend to be more cryptic. And so we haven't studied them as nearly as well. And so what we've been doing over the past 10 years or so in my work has been essentially playing catch up to all the wonderful studies of African savanna elephants. And so I'll briefly kind of go through what we know about how elephants behave based on that large volume of research on savanna elephants. And of course, I don't have time to go through all of it. I'm going to just focus on the part that I've been focusing on for much of my work, and that is the social organization and the social structure. Now, this isn't cognition, strictly speaking, but it's the thing that underlies cognition, because cognition is built up on how individuals interact with one another and with with aspects of their environment. So in order to understand how elephants think, it's really important to understand how their social systems are organized, what's important to them, and how they relate to other individuals. So as all elephants, Asian elephants, African elephants go, adult males and females have distinct and parallel societies. So when they reach adulthood, males disperse off into their own separate world, essentially, and females and calves have a parallel system. And the system is very elaborate, from possibly one of the most complex in the animal kingdom, and its structure is sort of like a wedding cake, which is to say that it has different levels. And at the bottommost level, we have individual elephants that very closely associate with their own family members, and these families are centered around females, and those families then associate with other families. These are termed bond groups, and those families are sort of like friends. They may be related, they may not be, and then a whole bunch of families may use a given area. They may or may not associate, or associate more rarely, and this has been termed clans, and so on, into subpopulations, populations, which occasionally may get together in these larger groups. And so this has been shown by 40 odd years of research, primarily in East Africa, but it pretty much seems like Savannah elephants all over do show, similar complexity. And so what are the other consequences of this? Well, social cognition in Savannah elephants, as you can imagine, with this very complex society, is quite highly developed. So this is a picture from a paper where you have in the upper panel a female sniffing for danger, and the rest of the group showing sort of vigilance behavior, and then they go off and retreat. So how does an elephant judge what is a threat and what is not a threat? Well, they have to have knowledge about those, whatever it is that they're detecting. So there has been, you've probably heard the term matriarch, and a matriarch is an older individual, a female, that has a very important role in elephant society. They may know other elephants, and they may have much more extensive knowledge than, say, younger individuals in their families. And as a consequence, they may know which individuals are friendly and which ones are not. They may also know what's a threat in the environment, predators, for instance, or in this case, humans. So elephants can not only distinguish among other elephants, but they also appear to be incredibly good at distinguishing among different types of people, different types of humans, based on things like scent and odor, based on odor and color. And in recent studies show that elephants can even determine more details about people, such as ethnicity, gender, and age, from just the sound of somebody's voice, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, if you think about this, this is a completely different species that is making these judgments about us. So, this is really fascinating. And when I hear about these types of studies, earlier on, I started to wonder, well, what exactly is a matriarch? Like, what does that mean? How is that defined? What is leadership, and how is that defined? If I look at other elephant species, would I see the same thing? I mean, if I go out and observe them, would they behave the same way? And should we expect them to behave the same way? And these concepts we sort of take for granted. I think we hear people talk about matriarchs and leadership and all of this in elephant society. But in fact, if we look at the other two species, it's a big mystery. African forest elephants have not been nearly as well studied. And so we don't really know if they exhibit as this sort of similar complex social organization. And what's been observed seems to suggest that they have a much more flexible social system. And then our research on Asian elephants, which I'll be focusing much more on for the rest of the talk, shows that there are, in fact, differences. So when it comes to social cognition, now, in the interest of full disclosure, I don't, strictly speaking, study cognition, because cognition is what goes on inside, the mind, right? It's how animals and think, and how they make decisions and judgments. But in this case, we're starting at a point that is prior to that. It's the behavior. We're observing behavior, and we can think of what does the behavior we observe sort of imply about cognition, and sort of it gives drives to more questions maybe that we could investigate. So to remind everyone, I always like to put elephants in context of their evolutionary history. So few people realize that the Asian and African elephants are separated by about 6 million years of evolution, which is, about the same amount of time as, the woolly mammoth branching off. And woolly mammoths are now, of course, extinct. But, 6 million years, that's a big number. And if it's difficult to wrap your head around, consider that that's about the span of time that also separates lions, tigers, and leopards. So no one would really mistake a lion for a tiger or a leopard for a lion, right? They're quite different. And one big difference is that tigers and leopards are solitary and lions live in social groups. And so visually they're distinct, so we kind of don't confuse them. But because elephants sort of maybe, it's easy to confuse elephants because they sort of superficially look the same, and they're all big animals. So I think people tend to assume that all elephants are the same, but really there's no need that they should be. And another thing that distinguishes the Asian and African elephants, of course, is that they evolved on different continents. And of course, the ancestors of Asian elephants did live on the African continent and even throughout Europe. But currently, the African savanna elephants live in a very different environment. It's an environment in which resources are very, it's distributed. They're spread out. Water holes may be quite far apart. It might be quite seasonal. There may be things that you have to know about the landscape in order to navigate it. And also, it has a lot of risks, like large social living predators that are actually capable of taking down elephants. And there are others, more solitary predators like leopards, but they don't pose as much of a threat for elephants. Now, in Asia, we do have some of the same predators. We have leopards. We also have the large predator, which is a tiger, but it's a solitary predator. Once upon a time, we used to have Asiatic lions, but they are not that common now, and they're pretty much restricted to a little part of India. So for the most part, we don't have as much of a threat from non-human predators in Asia. And then we have environments in which ostensibly the resources were historically more abundant. There was maybe more rainfall. And if you look at the parts of Asia in which elephants remain, you have some parts that are savanna-like. That's mainly in South India and in Sri Lanka. In parts of India and in Sri Lanka. And then you also have parts that are much more heavily forested and have even closed canopy rainforests, parts of India as well as Southeast Asia. And so there's a diverse array of environments in which Asian elephants live. And so what's interested me is, how do these different sort of factors potentially influence the way that elephants behave? And so in a nutshell, when we've compared an elephant population that I've been studying for a long time in southern Sri Lanka, which numbers possibly upwards of 1,000 individuals that we identify through photographs, and an elephant population that has been studied for a long time by George Whittemire and colleagues from Save the Elephants in East Africa. And we compared the social relationships between females, and here what you're seeing are dots representing individual adult females, and the lines connecting them are how often two individuals spent time together. So the heavier the line, the more time individuals spent together. And what you see for African savanna elephants is that their network is much more interconnected. So individuals tend to sort of know each other. A lot of individuals in the population tend to mix at some point. Whereas in the Asian population, the network is more fragmented. And sort of, if you think of these as being sort of family units or social groups, they are less likely to interact with one another. And so you don't get those connections. And that has consequences all the way down. So elephants have what we call a fission-fusion society, or fission-fusion social dynamics, which means that individuals get together and split up. So on the side of the African elephants, what you see is that families are fairly cohesive, and they get together and split up with other families, occasionally making larger groups. And there's a very strong seasonality to this. Wet seasons, dry seasons, the networks look different. In Asian elephants, in our population, what we see is that this fission fusion process occurs not at the level of families, but at the level of individuals. So at the level of a mother and her calf, that individual pair. And so as a consequence, the networks are much less connected, and there's relatively weak seasonal effects. So there's not much of a difference between dry seasons and wet seasons, and the networks tend to change over time. And now this has yet another consequence for this question that I posed at the beginning, which is what exactly is a matriarch and what's leadership? So if we take let's suppose two elephant families, let's imagine this family on top. Let's imagine that this one individual dominates the other individual with this arrow going from the dominant to the subordinate. She does that with little acts of aggression, or sort of putting this other individual in her place, maybe not in a super aggressive way, but just sort of little behaviors that show her who's boss. And these individuals in turn dominate younger individuals. So older individuals, which tend to be bigger, dominate younger individuals. And it's very rarely the case that a younger individual would dominate an older individual. And the same would happen in other families. Let's assume that this individual in front, she might be the more dominant individual, a larger individual. And they might have priority of access to things like water or other resources. Now, between families, we have the same thing happening. And in this case, the older individuals, the oldest, most dominant individuals in one family will dominate the oldest and most dominant individuals in another family, and so on down the line. And what this ends up creating is a linear hierarchy. So African savanna elephants have a very strong age and size-based hierarchy. And this is enforced by those repeated interactions, because families are fairly cohesive, they're around each other all the time. And then, they occasionally make these larger aggregations where individuals get to interact with, others outside of their family. And so they make these hierarchies. And a matriarch, really what it is by definition, she is the oldest and therefore usually the largest and most dominant individual. And in elephants, I just said, they don't have these they don't have these cohesive families. And so their associations being much more flexible, we would expect them to have weaker hierarchies. And in fact, this is what we see. So these two sort of busy diagrams are showing you, again, the individual elephants as circles, and they're colored according to the family that they belong to. And the larger circles are older individuals, and the smaller circles are younger individuals, and the arrows show who dominated who. And the point is that on the African side, on the savanna elephant side, the network is a lot more intense, it's a lot more busy, there's a lot more arrows flying around. And on the Asian side, there's a lot fewer. That means that there are just a lot more sort of dominance interactions and aggression being shown in the African population. And also, if you quantify this, there's also many more chances of a younger elephant dominating an older elephant in the case of Asian elephants, but not so much in the case of African savanna elephants. So things like reversals are much more common in Asian elephants than in Africans proportionally. And the consequence of this is that in Asian elephants, you don't see a very strong hierarchy, whereas in African savanna elephants, you do. And the simple sort of result of that, so we propose, is that in this situation where you have ecological constraints, where resources are spread out and you have predators and things that make movement mistakes very costly, you have the conditions for strong so-called leadership and also dominance. Whereas in situations where you have a more favorable environment, maybe, and more predictable environment with fewer predators, there isn't so much a drive to have strong leadership. So the work that I showed was based on primarily 2 years worth of observations. And now we've been analyzing, this is sort of sneak preview of things that we're working on now. We're looking at data from a longer time period. And this was a figure created by a graduate student, Annie Madsen at the University of Nebraska. And if we look over time, this is now with 9 years worth of data, you see that there's a lot of fluctuation in elephants moving between groups. So the lines that you're seeing are, the colors are social groups in any given year, And if you look across years, there's this flow between social groups of animals transferring between groups. And that happens quite a lot. And it actually is shocking, shockingly a lot when you think of, the sort of the picture of the stable family groups that we understand from African savanna elephants. So is this weird? Is this something that is abnormal in our population, or is this something that is more general to Asian elephants? And for that, we have some really interesting data from Sumatra. Now, these are collared individuals that you're seeing. Each of these dots is an animal running around, and you see, if you look at the sort of the lower part of the screen, you see many different colored dots, and the dots sort of like merge and then they split up, and that's different individuals, ostensibly from different social groups. When they were collared, people didn't know if they were one group or many groups, but they collared individuals from different groups. And what they see is that over time, individuals do sort of join up with others, and in some cases, they join up having possibly never met one another at all in the preceding 5 or 10 years. They can get as far as 25 to 30 kilometers apart from animals that they know and regularly associate with. And we have one instance, the graph on the right, of animals that were separated by over 100 kilometers. So those are animals that maybe, if they knew each other, it was a very long time ago. And then they get together at some point. So this fission fusion seems to happen. This is Sumatran elephants are a completely different subpopulation, even a different subspecies of Asian elephant. So to conclude, I think the really interesting questions we're just beginning to scratch the surface of. When elephants interact with one another, do they know each other? Do they know do they have a long history with those other animals that they're interacting with, or when they're learning from one another? Do they retain that for a long period of time? And I think that from my perspective, there's lots of interesting questions to be asked that are comparative, because we still know so little about Asian elephants and African savanna and African forest elephants. I think it's really interesting to compare to the picture that we have from the savanna elephants. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and leave you with this quote that I believe was a former Explorer Club member as well. Thank you.
That was amazing. Sateesh, do we have you back here? Oh, looks like not. Well, I will say, Sherman, Lawrence Anthony absolutely was an Explorers Club member, the Elephant Whisperer, I believe, as they called him. Mm-hmm. Incredible guy. He wrote that book, Babylon's Ark, about the zoo rescue in Iraq. So incredible guy. Sateesh, do we have you here?
Yeah, can you see and hear me now?
Yeah,
yep.
I know you're stuck in the Upper Peninsula there.
Yeah, there's not great internet. I've just changed up how I was doing things. So hopefully you can see me a little bit better now. If I cut out, just let me know. Thank you very much, Dr. De Silva. It's really interesting to see how very different these populations are. And then also how much looking at that long-term data of all the elephants is really changes how we kind of look at them in these populations over time and how they interact. Just looking at them in one day doesn't seem to be enough to get a good idea.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, did we have time for questions, or should I?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions for you. Yeah, I think we can do a few questions. The first question was, and I think you touched on it a little bit. Do you think the different habitats of these populations might have a little bit to do with their social structure? So for instance, you mentioned some of the African and Asian elephants, some of them live, especially within the Asian elephant groups that you look at, some of them live in the forest and some of them in the savanna. So do you think that has an influence on some of these social interactions?
Yeah, so absolutely. That's what's motivating this comparative research that I want to do. So I think what's really interesting about Asian elephants is precisely that they are one species that inhabits so many different habitats. And it's a very difficult question to answer, because if you think about it, that what that really means is that you have to have research on multiple projects, on multiple populations in different parts of the world, right? And be able to compare those. And so there are now some studies in southern India, for example, that show that there's an intermediate sort of system between what we see in Sri Lanka and what we see in East Africa. And is that related to the ecological conditions? That's an open question. So my working hypothesis is that it is, and it is determined, both by things like resource abundance and rainfall and all the things that that those environments have, but increasingly in the present, we're talking about human-elephant conflict, right? Also the human modifications of those landscapes, things like fragmentation and all the other obstacles and challenges that elephants have to deal with.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The next question is, do elephants split into separate gender groups at times? For instance, all male elephants gathering at a water hole, say, at specific rivers in a park. At the same question for females in imprints in that area. Have you seen any same-sex bonding in the field of your work? So I think the question's kind of asking, do you see, like, how do males kind of fit into this? We mostly talked about females, like do they kind of interact in the same way, and also like how does that variation shift from what we know about African elephants?
Yeah, so in our population, we see that bulls do form sort of groups. They're friendly towards other bulls, and they are sometimes unfriendly towards certain bulls. And so there is a sort of indication that there may be sort of friendships, at least, if not with relations, because bulls range so widely and they disperse away from their groups. They're very unlikely to be related to these other bulls that they hang out with. And there's observations from India that you have bulls in these very highly disturbed landscapes as well. And we have the same in Sri Lanka, where it looks like, if you look at them, they almost look like a herd of females. There's bulls of different ages. They're walking around together and they wait for each other. They even vocalize to each other, which rarely happens inside the national park. And so there are relationships among the bulls. We just are, again, completely just barely scratching the surface to know what those relationships are. In African savanna elephants, there are similarly bull groups, and in some cases quite large groups in different parts of the continent. So they don't all behave the same, even in savanna systems. So that's another really interesting area of future research.
Excellent. Yeah, that's really interesting. One person also just had a general question about some of the differences between African and Asian elephants. I know we're talking about both systems here. They were just asking, just in general, like, how is the size difference between the groups? And if you know, like, what kind of size difference are we talking about physically as well? So between African and Asian elephants, are they I think African elephants are taller, and then group size wise, what's kind of the differences that we're talking about?
Right, African savanna elephants are definitely the biggest of the three, and savanna elephants can get quite a foot or two taller than Asian elephants, and of course heavier correspondingly. And the African forest elephants, I believe, are a bit smaller as well, so they may be a little bit more comparable to Asian elephants in size. And in terms of groups, the comparison between East Africa, between Kenya and Sri Lanka, for instance, shows that with the Asian elephants, we're much more likely to see smaller groups and even individual females and their calves, a group of size 1. Whereas with African savanna elephants, you're much more likely to see a family, and it's quite rare to see a female and a calf, out on their own. And this varies quite a bit from place to place. So again, in India, you have a different group size, and there is a proposal that there may be sort of local constraints, ecological constraints on what that group size could be. So depending on how much food and other things might be available, that group size might change from place to place. But over the long term, as in our study, if you look at the long term, those little groups that you see out when you're out on safari and you're driving around are actually not the entire social group. So when we say a group, it's actually kind of misleading, because there's the actual thing that you see, and then there's the long term. You watch them for 2 years, then you understand the entire social world of that individual. And as you can see, you watch them for 10 years and you still maybe don't quite see the full thing, the full picture.
Excellent, thank you. We have a few more questions, but I think we're gonna try and move along right now. And as I said, we'll try and pick up some of those questions at the end during John's live stream with the elephants from Thailand. Thank you very much, Dr. De Silva. So for now, I want to move on and talk about, bring up our next speaker, Dr. Lisa Barrett. Lisa is a postdoctoral fellow at in animal behavior at Oklahoma City Zoo. She is particularly interested in individual variation among animals, including elephants, and their response to changes in the environment. Her first experience studying elephants was as a research assistant in Thailand with Dr. Joshua Plotnick, Plotnick's nonprofit group, Think Elephant International. As a member of the National Science Foundation, graduate research fellow, and a member of the Animal Behavior and Cognition Lab at the University of Wyoming, Lisa carried out her dissertation work on personality and cognition of captive Asian elephants. Today, Lisa will share her work on captive elephant personality, problem solving, social learning, and noting the benefits and drawbacks of working with elephants in captivity, including how research with these elephants in the zoos have important implications for their wild counterparts. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, Lisa.
Thanks, Sateesh. Can you hear me and see my slides okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to the Explorers Club and World Elephant Day. Happy World Elephant Day to everyone. And I'm really excited to talk to you about our zoo research with wild implications. Hopefully this will advance now. Okay, so as we are well aware by now, elephants are well known for their intelligence. We know this from observations of wild elephants, but also from experiments that empirically show us evidence of their intelligence. And there's actually been some really impressive experiments that have been conducted in the field with wild elephants. For example, one of my favorite studies ever was conducted by Bates and colleagues, who presented urine samples to African Savannah matriarchs leading their group, and found that the matriarchs were surprised when urine from someone in the back of the herd was placed in front of her, suggesting that elephants can identify and keep track of where their herd members are. But sometimes experiments are not always feasible with wild elephants, and observations of wild elephants don't always allow us to control for everything necessary to show empirical evidence that we need to show as scientists sometimes. And so there have been some other really great examples of the amazing capabilities of elephants from studies in zoos, where we can really put the elephant under a magnifying glass, so to speak, and ask questions about them that have never been asked before. So for example, from previous work with captive or semi-wild elephants, we know that Asian elephants are capable of recognizing themselves in a mirror, as Sarah mentioned, which is an ability that we share with only a handful of other species. Now, ironically, some of these abilities are thought to aid animals in coping with change in their environments, like human-caused disturbances. But as you're well aware, elephants are in decline, in part due to conflict with humans. And so these abilities might actually make them more prone to conflict, which is interesting. And so we can use the lens of conservation to examine these abilities in elephants. And I'll be touching on some of these abilities today. We'll start with social learning. As you're familiar, and as Sherman just told us about, elephants live in large, complex social groups. And we know from previous research that they can cooperate with one another. We know that young elephants will learn how and what to eat from their older relatives. And we also know that in the wild, male African savanna elephants who associate with crop raiding males are more likely to exhibit this risky crop raiding behavior themselves. And so this really begs the question then, could they be learning from each other? And so we tested this using a traditional test from the primate literature, where an animal solves by adding more water to a tube that contains a reward, in this case, a peanut. So here an orangutan solves by adding more water to a tube while her baby is watching. And there she gets the peanut. And since elephants can move and hold water with their trunks, we thought this would be a particularly interesting task to give them. With the elephants, we presented a demonstrator with a tube filled about 1/3 of the way with water baited with a floating marshmallow, while an observer elephant watched the demonstrator solve. And we then gave the tube to the observer elephant to see if they could solve. And we did this 3 times. And we compared the observer's performance to that of a naive control elephant who did not receive a demonstration before attempting to solve on their own. So we found that one elephant was capable of using water as a tool in this way, and she solved the task on her own. This was Shanti at the National Zoo. So here she is. This video is sped up in the interest of time, but she's adding water from her drinker to the tube to reach that marshmallow. And then Shanti served as a demonstrator for other elephants at the National Zoo. So here she'll get the marshmallow at the top. And then at the Oklahoma City Zoo, our chosen demonstrator, Chandra, did not solve the task on her own, but we took advantage of the fact that we were doing this study in a zoo setting and took advantage of the trained behaviors that Chandra already knew. And we had her learn to solve by clicker training her. So here she's adding water from a hose to the tube, and then adding water from her drinker to the tube. And soon Chandra began solving on her own and could serve as a demonstrator so that we could study social learning at this other zoo. Here she is demonstrating for a younger elephant. Now, we didn't find that any other elephant solved the task. However, we did find that at one zoo, observers spent more time interacting with the task compared to control elephants. This was via a form of social learning called stimulus enhancement. And interestingly, observers at the zoo were related to the demonstrator. And so relatedness could have played a role in terms of who paid attention to whom, as we might expect. And conducting our work in a zoo allowed us to be sure, of course, who was related to who without having to do genetic testing as we might have needed to do in the field. So given that only one elephant solved the task on her own, I became really intrigued as to why this was. And this actually reminded me of a sign I saw in Sri Lanka outside of Udawalawe National Park when I was visiting the research team at Trunks and Leaves. I was told that this sign, and Shermin, correct me if I'm wrong, it says something along the lines of, do not feed this elephant. If you're caught feeding this elephant, you'll be fined. And I couldn't help but wonder, what is it about this elephant that makes him a problem compared to other elephants? And could it be something about his personality that kind of helps him be able to acquire more resources from humans? And so I wanted to think about this in terms of personality. And in humans, of course, it's pretty easy to assess personality. We can use a Myers-Briggs personality test. There are surveys online you can take, like fun ones like which Kardashian family member are you? But in non-human animals, it's not so easy. But if you have pets at home, you're probably very familiar with your pet's personality type. Here is a popular video circulating the internet that shows personality in 2 types of dogs.
You have the dogs that love the water. And then you have the dogs that hate the water.
So there you can really clearly see variation among dogs in terms of how they react to this water situation. And that's actually one of the keys to showing evidence of animal personality. We look for variation among individuals, and we also look for consistency within individuals. So we would expect that dogs who maybe don't like the water also don't like when the mailman approaches. Maybe they act more shy in that other context as well. And so in animals, we look for these two key components. So to test for this consistent variation in elephants, we collaborated with 3 zoos and leveraged a few different methods to get a comprehensive look at personality. We conducted behavioral observations to look at traits like activity and aggression. We presented elephants with novel objects like mylar balloons. This is Mary at the San Diego Zoo interacting with those. We also used the scent of lion urine. And then we took advantage of the intimate knowledge that keepers have about their animals, and we had them score each elephant on traits like activity, aggression, boldness. We found evidence of consistent personality through observations and surveys, but not novel objects, perhaps because of how different the objects were from one another. And next, we looked at whether personality was related to the ability to solve a novel problem. Like Sarah mentioned, we could use this as a proxy for looking at ability to overcome deterrence in the wild. And so we designed novel foraging puzzle boxes like the boxed ball and the rod ball you see here, which have parts that must be manipulated in order to retrieve food inside. And we adapted the trap tube paradigm from the primate literature, which for elephants was solved by blowing or sucking. So in this version, you see elephants could solve by blowing from the left side or sucking from the right side. If they blew from the right side, for example, the apple would become trapped and the trial would end. So here's what this looked like. This is a solve. And the next elephant will blow hard enough from the incorrect side that the apple blew over the trap, which we weren't expecting. And lastly, a trap. And in terms of personality, we found that traits correlated with success, but it was task dependent. So for example, more active elephants were faster to solve the trap tube task, but more aggressive elephants were faster to solve the boxed ball. So what does all this mean for wild counterparts? Well, personality could predict an ability to solve a novel problem, such as how to overcome a barrier to access crops or how animals habituate to deterrence, as Sarah suggested earlier. And social learning, such as stimulus enhancement, could be enabling the spread of maladaptive behaviors. So it's possible we could target intervention efforts like focusing on tracking certain individuals or designing deterrence tailored to personality type. For example, work with brown bears has found individuality and habitat preferences, which meant that specific problem bears could be targeted to deter them from people. We can also profile captive elephants to determine ideal candidates for reintroduction, as has been found with swift fox individuals. So those that were classified as bold, according to different behavioral measures, were more likely to die within 6 months of release to the wild. So despite these implications for wild counterparts, with any research, of course, comes caveats. And for zoo research, there are a few disadvantages that come to mind. So first, of course, that animals face different challenges in a zoo setting than they would in the wild. Along the same lines, they're usually trained and familiar with artificial objects, which means that their behavior is inherently different than a wild elephant's. And we're also dealing with a lot of times small sample sizes. So all of these considered together means it's difficult to extrapolate to all elephants when you're just working with a select few. On the flip side, there are several advantages to doing research in zoos, some of which have been touched on that I mentioned earlier. So having a lot of control in terms of testing and taking, getting rid of distractors and things like that, or as controlled as you can get when working with elephants. Also in the wild, we have to consider things like whether our baited puzzle boxes might encourage elephants to invade farmland or seek out human resources. Whether that's true or perceived to be true, that's something we have to consider. Also in zoos, we usually know the background and experience of subjects, which I mentioned was important in our social learning study to know relatedness. And for me, a big one is being able to assess personality. In the wild, sometimes you can't rely on seeing the same individual multiple times as would be necessary in order to show evidence of personality. And then there are some more intangible benefits, like providing enrichment, providing cognitive stimulation for elephants that live in human care. And I like to hope that by doing research in zoo settings, we can kind of inspire the next generation of zoo visitors by teaching them about these awesome capabilities of elephants, and hope that it fosters conservation empathy, so they're more inspired to help wild elephants, or at least hopefully we can educate the public so they're more scientifically informed. So with that, I'd like to thank our funders, zoo staff, and research assistants for making this work possible. And thanks again to Sateesh and everyone for inviting me to give this talk. If there's time, I'd be happy to take any questions, or you can contact me via Twitter.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's great to see all of your different experiments that you've been running, and all of the different problems and puzzles that you give to the elephants. I had one question. How did you come up with some of the designs for some of these puzzle boxes that you've come up with for the elephants?
Good question. Just through observations of the elephants, both in Thailand, working with pink elephants, and visiting Sherman's field site in Sri Lanka. I remember watching an elephant do some bark stripping, and that kind of inspired some puzzle box design. And then wanting to see if these paradigms used for more traditional subjects in comparative psychology, like primates that are more visual, and trying to adapt them for elephants that are not as visual. I thought that was really interesting to try. So,
yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, let me see if there's any other questions that we have here. Do any of the other presenters, Sarah or Sherman, do you guys have any questions for Lisa? Well, wait. I had another question as well. When you're looking into these individual differences in elephants, how do you think we can apply some of these with wild studies, like, or with just how can we apply individual differences in how we treat elephants in captivity as well?
Yeah, well, I think you, Sarah, and I should team up to tackle that. That will be the next big question, is to find out what are the traits of these, nuisance individuals. Is it the innovators who are getting past the fences or habituating faster to deterrence? Are they also the super spreaders of crop breeding behavior? I guess my answer is we need more research with wild elephants to kind of confirm which traits are most important. And then in captivity, I think it's really useful for the caretakers to have this personality profile information, just to know who works well together, who doesn't, when potentially, considering different grouping arrangements with animals, or for breeding, or how they're going to respond to new situations.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting. I know I've also seen it with some of my work in Myanmar with the semi-wild population. The mahouts all seem to know kind of how their elephant is, and it's interesting to see how they react very differently when their elephant doesn't always react the way they expect. And it shows just a little bit about like how when you're doing these tests, like what you're doing with the novel objects and all these different puzzle boxes, that sometimes the elephants act in completely unpredictable ways.
Definitely.
We have another question here. Have you come up with a way to compare elephant stress levels in captivity versus being in the wild?
I have not. I'm not sure if anyone's working on that. I know some people are working on it in captive situations, like they're always monitoring stress to maintain good animal welfare. I'm not sure if there's any comparative work with wild animals. Someone else might know that.
Yeah, I don't know of any that does like a direct comparison with the wild. I know one of our speakers from the first day, Dr. Mumby, had done some work with stress levels in semi-wild elephants and comparing those to captive elephants in tourist camps. So that's like one of the kind of comparative ways that you can look at, but not quite the same with, you know, zoos and wild.
Right.
It's a little bit hard to carry out those studies. Here's another question. Do you think that the elephants enjoy the challenge of the puzzles?
I like to think so. They always have a choice to come participate in research, so they don't need to if they're having an off day or don't want to. I do think that in general, elephants are pretty food motivated. Hopefully Sarah's finding that as well with her puzzle boxes. I don't know. But yeah, they did. Most of them solved all of the puzzle boxes multiple times.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, well, if anybody else has any more questions, you can put them in the chat and we can try and answer some more of those. Right now, I'd like to introduce our last presenter, and our last presenter, John Roberts. John is a member of the Asian Elephant Specialist Group of the IUCN Species Survival Commission. He also runs the Golden Triangle Asian Elephant Foundation in northern Thailand. The foundation still cares for elephants in the forest and grasslands and provides for them by the Anta Golden Triangle Hotel in the far north of Thailand. And he's going to join us today as he live streams with some of his elephants out there in the field. I think I can see John now. So I'm going to turn it over to John. Thank you. And tell us a little bit about your elephants there.
Well, hi, Sateesh. Hello, World Elephant Day. Hello, the Explorers Club and everybody else. And as I've said privately to everybody else, I think we should be, if this were a concert, we should be the opening act. But it's a pleasure to be rounding off such a because I'm glad to be able to bring you elephants first thing in the morning, about 7 o'clock here in the Golden Triangle. We have 3 elephants. We have Lana over there, who, if we're talking, oh, there's a hare. There's a wild Asian hare. We don't see those very often. So you didn't join for the hare, but we get excited. Talking about personalities of elephants, we have Lana over there, who's a bit of a loner. So normally she's not with this friendship group. And then we have 2 elephants that are very closely bonded here, who are Mare Noi and Mare Mu. Mare Mu is one of our older elephants. And you can see she's wearing some of her chopped up geriatric feed on her head, which elephants like to do, not necessarily the chopped up geriatric feed bit, but they like to wear their food on their head. They like to coat themselves. And then her much younger friend, Mare Noi, who's in her 30s, I think. Someone can correct me on that. I don't know much about her. 20s. She's too old. Okay, sorry. She's in her 20s. And Mare Mu's in her 50s. I can never remember elephants' ages. So we are the Golden Triangle Asian Elephant Foundation. As you said, up here in far north Thailand. We do have projects across Southeast Asia, mainly helping captive elephants, quite more so even in COVID times now, but also a bit of work with wild elephants. What we do here with our 20 elephants on site, as I say, is where we have about 400 acres. And what we try to do is make sure that they are given space, friendship groups, and all the things that elephants need, and work on, if you like, better ways for elephants in captivity. People have had elephants in captivity in Asia for around 4,000 years, but it's not easy to give elephant what it needs, particularly now when you don't have the areas of jungle that elephants can move around in, or as you were saying earlier, the semi-captive elephants in Myanmar that are able to go out into the forest overnight. In places like Thailand, they don't have the chance to do that in the vast majority of cases. So what we focus on here is try and find ways that we can work with the traditional communities We can work with elephants, the government. We can work with all sorts of other people, including zoos and zoo experts, to try and find ways in saying, yes, we have these elephants in captivity. There is great debate as to whether they should be here, whether we should be reducing the numbers, whether we should be increasing the numbers. You see them all periscoping there. They think some food's coming, I think. All three of them now periscoping, sniffing the air. This is the road at the top that sometimes the food truck comes along. So we'll see what comes along in 2 or 3 minutes. So that's part of the debate that's there. But at the moment, we have something like 3,800 elephants in captivity in Thailand alone, something like 6,000 in Myanmar, and slightly fewer in other Southeast Asian countries. And then India and Sri Lanka are a whole different set of numbers. But again, same animal, same constraints on captivity, same lack of forest. So again, what we try to do here is look at ways that we can have elephants on site, that we can give them what they need, and maybe look at ways that other folks can perhaps look after elephants better in captivity. Our main unit, I guess, for looking after the elephants is the friendship group. So we try and find other places who do sort of free roaming like this, allow for aggression among their elephants. So we might be about to see some, because Savannah, the loner, is sometimes an elephant that pushes. We try to avoid it. We try to find elephants that like each other, that get along. Very, very going on into personalities, as Lisa was just now. We do identify, although not scientifically, different elephant personalities, and you can definitely see that in the way that some elephants will get along with any elephant. Some elephants prefer to be in their friendship group only. And we try to keep them in that way, and then they come out free roaming, walking around here, guided by mahouts, who are their traditional keepers. The guys, as I say, who some of them, their families have been looking after elephants. We have no proof for 4,000 years whether it was the same family, but there are some very ancient surnames who work with us, and we keep them in these little areas. There's another elephant way over there, and try and help make sure that they have what they need. And then I live stream twice a day. So we can see Menoi. Well, there we go. Live elephants.
She knows where the sugarcane is.
The sugarcane just arrived, did
Yes.
it? Okay, so what they were periscoping was that motorbike. There's a guy up there convoy has just turned up and had a sugarcane delivery. We do work on diet plans. We do try and limit. Oops. That's sugarcane coming over. Menoi may have. You see how easily elephants climb up vertical slopes. They're not supposed to do that, but it's very, very difficult to keep an elephant in that doesn't want to be kept in. They are not acrobatic particularly, but that's a vertical slippery slope that a 3.5-ton animal is climbing up for a bunch of sugarcane. So they'll get a daily bunch of sugarcane. Most of the time, because this is natural habitat, they spend their time grazing all of this grass here, or eating bamboo, or the various other plants here in the grassland, or up in the bamboo forest that we have. But we do still bring them some treats. Have to be some benefits of being in captivity, I suppose. So, I mean, I think that's us in a nutshell. Is there anything anybody would like to know? Do we have any questions, I suppose, about our other projects or anything along those lines?
Yeah, well, we have a couple of questions here. It's great to. I was just going to say it's great to see the elephants doing a lot of the stuff that we have talked about in some of these other talks today. Also bringing in some of the social groups and interactions that we talked about, and also the food motivation and not being able to keep them where you want them to be. So it's great
exactly.
To live.
But there we go. This is of course not a natural herd, but they yes, we I guess it was observation of activities like this that allowed people to come up with like Think Elephants to come up with, well, how do we prove that what we think we're seeing is what we're seeing? And then the next step goes on to, again, with Think Elephants and Co, is that how can we use what we learn to help protect them in the wild, which is the ultimate goal. So I'm glad the elephants are misbehaving in a way that works out with what has been said previously today.
Yeah. One of the questions somebody had was how many resident elephants do you have there?
20 elephants at the moment. We at one point we set up ourselves up as a foundation during the last coronavirus crisis, which was SARS, which was relatively mild. But elephants in Thailand, at least, elephants had since the days when the removing of timber from the forest was banned, which was their main career, if you like. What the justification that people had for keeping elephants in captivity was that they helped humans remove logs from the forest, or they worked to remove logs from the forest. Since logging was banned, the elephants had taken in all of the income it costs to, or I'm sure we've said earlier today, each elephant eats about 250 kilograms of food a day. Because most elephants aren't able to get free roaming and get access to this sort of habitat, almost all that food has to be bought in, which is an extremely expensive endeavor. So keeping an elephant is a very expensive endeavor. And yet the families who have traditionally done this are not rich families. And so when they have to find ways to, if you like, definitely use their elephants to make money to feed their elephants. And that is the way the system works. Now, for better or worse, there are great debates as to whether that should be the case or not, but that's the way the system is and has been, as I say, for probably 4,000 years. So very, very difficult to change it overnight if we don't like it. But what happened during the last the SARS crisis, was that tourism in Thailand dropped off totally. Let's the hair come back again for a very short time. Very, very neat. That vet is going to go off and check out the hair. It was for 3 or 4 months, and the elephants lost their income, but of course continued to need to eat. So they ended up begging on the streets of Bangkok. They would take their elephants into Bangkok, and they would sell bananas and sugarcane cut up to tourists or to locals to feed back to the elephants, and that was the way they made their money. We set ourselves up as a kind of alternative to that, because we had space and we had income from guests coming through the hotel when tourism picked up again, to say, well, look, Bangkok, which is, I don't know if anybody's ever been there, but think of any large, polluted, noisy, dark, sorry, I've been rude about your home, Nisa, city, but it's not a good place for elephants. I think everybody can agree. So we set ourselves up as an alternative to that, and ended up at one point with about 40 baby elephants running around the place, which was fun. But a lot of them have gone back and done other things tourism-wise now, and we're now at about 20 elephants, which I think is much easier to manage to start with, and also allows us to play with greater degrees of freedom and with the friendship group model that we've been working on.
Excellent. I have a question here for Dr. De Silva from before. If you're still here, I'd like to ask it.
Yep, fire away.
If a group of elephants had to relocate, would the matriarch converse with local matriarchs to learn local information, or would join another group, or individually break off, etc.? Like, how would a relocated group of elephants interact with a new population?
That's a really interesting question, and so this has actually been studied in African savanna elephants, where there for various reasons, entire family groups were relocated from one location to another. And so this was several years ago, research by Noah Pinter-Wollman, and they were interested in, did these families interact with the resident elephants or not? And in the savanna elephant condition, again, the answer depends a little bit on the time frame that you're looking. Initially, as you might imagine, I think they are reluctant, and so they tend to stick to themselves. And if you think about the social system that I described, that might make sense, because you might be met with dominant other individuals that are familiar with the area. Although you might have a lot to learn from them, they may not take too kindly to a strange group of elephants. But we don't know, if you were to observe it over time, over a longer time frame, how that would eventually play out. In our situation, we haven't had so much opportunities to observe wild groups being introduced to other wild groups. But we have a case of orphans, so animals that were small, and they were somehow separated from their herds that had been rehabilitated and released into the wild. And in next to Ulawali National Park, there is something called this Elephant Transit Home, and they've released animals, and they do get absorbed by the herds. And whether there is any conversing going on, in terms of the communication We don't really know. Of course, elephants are very vocal, and they communicate in various ways that we may or may not perceive. And so certainly there are interactions, and we have seen that these connections can last quite a long time. So we observed, for instance, a female that we think is wild, who had entertained, her group had been familiar with these orphans some time ago. And when the orphans, as they grow up and they have their babies of their own, they separate, split, and form their own social groups. But many years later, we observed one of those former orphans actually nursing the calf of one of these wild females who she had known way back when. And so, they must tend to, obviously they remember one another, even if they don't associate over long periods of time. And, given that we don't really have this sort of matriarchal leadership, it happens on a much more individual basis. Maybe individuals like each other, maybe they don't, as probably Robert can also attest. John can also attest. And so that's much more individual basis.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting to see like how with Asian elephants, it makes it kind of a different situation with the complexity of how they interact socially. It looks like John's kind of getting overrun with elephants, but I'll try and ask him a question.
Well, yeah, that tends to happen. So the idea is to watch them and see where they go and to stay out of their way. And they'll come and say hello to us from time to time. Yes, you see over there, Kunboy, the mahout is feeding the elephants. We're very careful ourselves not to feed elephants so they don't come and crowd us. But sometimes they'll see us and wonder if we have food. So it's obviously what you're seeing here is not entirely natural behavior. These are captive elephants. They'll come and see us and say hello from time to time. But the idea, there we go, a bit of elephant reaching. Lana loves bamboo. Again, talking of personality types, certainly have favorite foods. If you were looking for Lana, she's always at a bamboo area somewhere. I don't know what Convoy is going to go and do.
I was actually wondering, as you say that, John, I was wondering if, either Sarah or Sherman, if you've seen some preferred foods that some of these elephants eat when they go into crop fields in the wild.
So I can briefly say we've also got camera traps set out, and we didn't talk about that so much, but we definitely, elephants love paddy, and this is a staple crop, which can get them in a lot of trouble as well. Just they don't have to necessarily eat it, but they just have to walk through it. But of course, they like to eat it as well. And unfortunately, as you've seen, they love things that are sweet, so things like sugarcane. Are found in Utawalwe, right across literally across the road from the boundary of the national park. So things like this can get them into a lot of trouble because you plant a temptation right near elephant habitat. And of course, there are a lot of food crops that are food for humans, delicious fruit crops that are high value. And of course, that's also perfect elephant food. So they definitely prefer things that are sweet over their regular rock forage, as you might imagine, wouldn't you? So that can be a very bad mix in elephant habitat.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that. It also comes through with the corn crops that are nearby. Like they'll wait till they are the most ripe to actually start eating them. So again, they're looking for that more sweet, more caloric food. So in our area, it's sugarcane, corn, and then there's also cassava that they really enjoy. And we definitely see seasonal differences. They're not going to eat it at all times of the year. They seem to know when is best, when it's right.
John, do you have?
Yes, it would be very interesting. Very interesting as some of the studies develop to see, and I think it's been seen in Africa, where elephants will know in a certain area the mangoes are ripe, so they seem to turn up at that certain time, and then a couple of months later they'll move on to the next thing, and when the next crop in another area becomes ripe or ready to eat, they'll move across and concentrate there. It's going to be interesting. I don't know of any study in Asia that's been done that way, but it'll be very interesting to see. If I do know in one of the areas where we help fund some community volunteers to try and keep elephants and people separate, the elephants certainly seem to disappear from the area until such time as it's harvest season, so the corn is ripe, and then these bachelor groups will suddenly turn up out of the forest and start eating. Now, whether that's being able to smell it from a long distance or whether that's a memory from this time last year is another question altogether. But it'd be very interesting to see if they actually, if they're given large areas to roam, if migratory patterns are changed by crop choices of humans. Sorry, not my lane, but interesting to see how I'm following the work.
No, that would definitely be very interesting. We have another question for you, John. Somebody wants to know why the elephants don't have any tusks.
Because they are Asian elephants. So these are all female, and female Asian elephants do not grow tusks. They will grow a smaller version, and I don't think you can see them on Lana here. She's got one on the other side. In Thai called kanai, I believe in Hindi called a tush. But yes, in Asian elephants, the females do not grow tusks, whereas in African elephants, both sexes do grow tusks. I hesitate with all these experts in the room to start to talk about evolution, but one of the theories I've heard for this is in Asia, we don't have the predators that might harm elephants are solitary. And we basically only have the tiger. I've done on an evolutionary timescale. I'm not sure how true that is. Whereas in Africa, there are prides of lions, and there are other predators that can be more dangerous to an elephant. As you can imagine, elephants have very, very few predators. But I shouldn't really talk about that with all these experts in the room. But definitely and for sure, Asian elephants, females do not grow tusks, just these small kanai. Whereas males can. Not every male grows a tusk either. Some males remain tuskless.
If I may add, just also, not all males have tusks either. So very important for conservation for Asian elephants is that not all males have tusks, and depending on where you are, it's a different proportion. So in Sri Lanka, we have very few. It's like 3 to 5% of the males that have tusks, and even most of the bulls don't. Whereas in Thailand or elsewhere, you might have much larger population. And another possible reason why they don't have tusks is very interesting that. In species where you have strong dominance hierarchies in various kinds of cattle and antelope, for instance, the weaponry associated with females tends to develop more. And that actually has to do more with not so much predators, but the sort of like the agonism, the aggression between individuals of the same sex and within the same species. So it's interesting to speculate, although we don't have the shooting, the smoking gun here, that if that might be the case for elephants as well, because you have these weaker hierarchies, and maybe that's why females don't have tusks. And as a consequence, some of the bulls don't develop tusks as well, because the genetics of it just doesn't work out. We don't quite know.
Interesting.
I like your theory, Sherman. I'll go with that one in future. I like it. Makes a great deal of sense.
And I think, at least from my opinion, and anybody else can jump in, but having tusks, they do help with things like digging, but usually elephants find other solutions without having tusks to dig and get to things. So it's not necessarily a disadvantage for getting food.
And exactly, and genetically, it takes the energy that it takes to grow tusks can take away from the bulk of an elephant. So it's in the logging days, people much preferred a tuskless male. A cedar in Thai up in the forest, because they tended to be, or at least allegedly were stronger, perhaps slightly more aggressive as well, because the theory was that they hadn't put all that energy into growing the tusks, so they were able to bulk up more. Whereas, of course, in the logging days, tusks were used. They have other purposes. But yes, it could be. And again, experts in the room can tell me if I'm wrong. That the tuskless males tend to be bigger and stronger, which also would make sense not only with energy balance, but also if you're sometimes might have to contest yourself with a tusked male, you want to be bigger and stronger than him. So there are advantages. There seem to be advantages to not having tusks, as well as advantages to having tusks.
Yeah. It looks like there's one of the elephants is stealing some food out of the other one's mouth there.
I think that's just communication. I think they're just sniffing one another's mouths. They tend to do that a lot in communication. The fact that they have food in their mouths as well is by the by, elephants always have food in their mouths. It does look like that, but I don't think that's what's going on. I have seen attempts to steal like long sticks of sugarcane, but actually removing food from an elephant's mouth is impossible, as any Thai person will tell you. There's a Thai idiom that says food in an elephant's mouth is something you can never get back. Somebody will have to tell me what that actually that sounds like in Thai. But yes, I think they're
Yes, it is.
Sorry, go on, louder. What is it in Thai? Oh, so sugarcane already in the elephant's mouth is something you can't get back. And I think that's true for other elephants as well. But they do tend, when they communicate, they tend to sniff one another's ears, sniff one another's mouths, as part, or maybe touching. But since it's their nose, we're guessing it's their sniffing as well. Probably getting information of all sorts from them. They can tell a lot about one another through smelling different bodily fluids. But also there's a lot of touching, and actually a Think Elephants piece on conciliatory behavior as well. Not that those two seem to be comforting one another. I think they were just talking. And as I say, these two are Lana, who's generally alone, the one the lady who's closest to us, and then Mare Mu, who's generally with Mare Mu. So these two don't see each other very often. So they're just getting together and they're chatting, if you like, going over old non-verbal communication is what I think that was.
I have another question here, and it's kind of for anybody that has experience with it. Somebody wants to know about how long the grieving period is in the elephant world. I know there's been a few instances of people seeing grieving within elephant societies. And then also specifically, do you see some grieving like when one member of a clan dies? Are there attendees from another clan that may like interact with that dead individual, or have some sort of relationship with the dead from other clans? I think maybe Sherman or anybody else, if they have any experience with that.
Yeah, so the sort of behavior of sort of being curious around an animal that has died has been observed in both African elephants, Savannah elephants, and Asian elephants. And it's hard to say, where that stems from. Certainly, if it's a relative, in the case of Savannah elephants, they might seem to know and be very familiar, with the individual that died, and they might pass that way again and again over time, even long after the bones are scattered, and they may handle the bones and things like that. We see behavior in Asian elephants as well of handling bones and picking up bones and things like that. They don't necessarily have to be related. They don't necessarily have to have known that individual. Also, we've seen a female sort of standing over the body of a calf that had died and had nothing to do with her. So just, it was not part of her family or anything like that. And similarly, other sort of, incidents. So it's hard to say, with Asian elephants, given this sort of long-term dynamic, whether they would ever have known that individual and what they can tell from the scent, it obviously that changes over time as, the remains decay and things like that. It's hard to say. In terms of grieving, I mean, it's hard to describe what grieving might be to an elephant, to understand what that looks like for an elephant, because they do move on. They need to for their foraging regions. They can't stick around in an area for too long. So you don't see them sort of, in Asian elephants at least, coming back repeatedly as you do in some other contexts.
But the very interesting thing, and whether it's a sad, which I tend to see whether it's a sad reflection on captivity, is we have had elephants die here over the years. We've been operating for 20 years. And we haven't observed, even with very, very closely bonded, and even one mother and baby, the young, she was 2.5, 3 years old, probably a bit older, was hit by snake bite. And we were expecting to see, because we've read the literature and we've heard about the observations in the wild, and we saw nothing. They didn't show any change in behavior. Almost, they came up and sniffed once or twice and moved on. So It's very, very interesting. And whether something in the dynamic of captivity changes the character, I don't know. But yes, it's on a couple of occasions now we've had elephants where we thought, okay, as you would, somehow an older elephant passed away, or the elephant died of snake bite. And we thought, okay, we'll bring the friends up for a final. We tend to get anthropomorphic about these things. But also we've read the observations, we've read the papers. So we know that in the wild, these things happen. So we thought we'd give them a chance to grieve. And they've almost shown that they've just moved on and gone and done something else. No interest at all in the body of their dead friend. Which we considered. I mean, again, we talk about friendship groups. It's a human thing. We know it. We know from your observations that it occurs in the wild, and we know that elephants can be closely bonded. But funnily enough, it's very, very interesting to me that we didn't see any of that sort of behavior in these small subset of captive elephants, which is interesting to me anyway.
Yeah, I think I've had similar experiences, which I thought was interesting. That I've worked with some captive elephants in northern Thailand in a similar program like yours, John, and we had a baby that died due to a disease, and which is fairly common within the captive elephant community, just because some of those diseases kind of are consistent over lots of the population there. So the baby died fairly young, and we thought that the mother would probably they buried the elephant, and we thought the mother would come to the burial site often, but it turned out that the mother didn't seem to actually go anywhere near the burial site, which was interesting. But some of the other group, so like the grandmother and some of the one of the older individuals that was part of the group but wasn't directly related, actually spent a lot of time kind of near that burial site. So it was just kind of an odd thing. I don't really have a reason to explain it, but it was something that was just interesting.
Yeah.
Just another anecdote to add to that, and this really shows variation, and why that is an interesting question. In Sumatra, in a place where I visited, we visited several villages, and there's one instance in which people recalled that a calf had been separated from the herd, and I think they had tried to rescue it, but eventually it died or something like this. And then that herd did revisit the site again and over different periods and seasons, and they came to the location where the calf had fallen into a pit or something like this. So again, it might depend very much on the experiences of those particular elephant populations and how closely they rely on each other and how closely bonded they are. And yeah.
Very interesting.
Yep.
Well, it's been great to talk to everybody. I'm glad everybody could join us. Thank you, Sarah, Lisa, and Shermin for your great talks. And thank you, John and the elephants, for giving us a little bit of a tour of and an experience to watch some live elephants today. It's a great addition to World Elephant Week, and I hope everybody can join the Explorers Club and World Elephant Day tomorrow to check out all the events. Check out the World Elephant Day website. And then again, tomorrow at 7 p.m., Patricia Sims will be from World Elephant Day. We'll be doing an entire lecture series with some amazing speakers and a panel as well. So please check out World Elephant Day tomorrow, and I'll leave you guys saying goodbye to all the elephants there, moving around in the background.
They're moving around. They make me nervous when they move around. Let's find out where they're going.
Thanks, Sateesh. Bye, Lana.
Thank you, Sateesh.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.